The call came on a Tuesday morning just as I was pulling out of the driveway to get to the hardware store. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I almost let it go to voicemail. I wish sometimes I had. It was Chester Boone, the contractor I'd hired 6 weeks earlier to renovate my late wife's workshop behind the house. Margaret had used it as a ceramic studio for 30 years. After she passed last March, I couldn't look at it anymore. All those half-finished pieces still sitting on her shelves, all her tools laid out like she'd just stepped away to make coffee and would be back in a minute. I finally decided in September that I needed to do something with it. Turn it into a proper storage space, maybe. Something practical. Something that didn't make me stop breathing every time I walked past the window and caught a glimpse of her apron hanging on the hook by the door. Chester had been recommended by my neighbor Ed Kowalski, who'd used him to redo his back porch. Solid guy. Punctual. Fair pricing. I'd met with him twice before the work started and never had a bad feeling about him. So when his name came up on the screen, I figured it was something routine. A question about the shelving. Maybe he needed to know if I wanted to keep the utility sink or pull it out. I answered on the third ring. He said, "Mr. Sutter, I need you to come out here. I said I was on my way to the store. Could it wait until this afternoon?" He said, "No, sir, it really can't." Something in his voice made me put the car in park. "What is it?" I asked. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "I'd rather you see it in person, but friends, and I hope this doesn't come out wrong. I think you should bring both your sons with you. Don't come alone." I sat in my own driveway for a long moment after he hung up. The engine was still running. A crow was walking across the lawn like he owned the place. Both my sons. I hadn't had both my sons in the same room in nearly 2 years. I should tell you a little about my family because none of what comes later makes sense without it. My wife Margaret and I were married for 41 years. We built everything together, literally. We bought this house in 1987 when it was a wreck, and we fixed it up with our own hands on weekends. We raised 2 sons here, taught them to throw a baseball in the backyard, helped them with homework at the kitchen table, watched them graduate and move out and start their own lives. The older one is my son Patrick. He's 43 now. He works in commercial real estate in Charlotte. Patrick always had a head for money. From the time he was 12 years old and figured out he could buy candy bars at the wholesale club and resell them at school for a profit, he was always thinking 3 moves ahead. Margaret used to say he came out of the womb calculating interest rates. My younger son is Barry. He's 39. Barry is softer than his brother, always was. Spent 2 years after college trying to make it as a musician before he settled into a steady job managing a restaurant supply warehouse in Raleigh. He and Patrick have never been close, not really. Different temperaments, different ideas about what matters in life. After Margaret passed, the distance between them got worse. I didn't see it at first. You don't when you're in the middle of grief. You're just trying to get through the days. Make breakfast, answer sympathy cards, figure out how to use the washing machine because your wife always handled that and you never paid attention, and you're 68 years old and standing in the laundry room at 11 o'clock at night holding a bottle of detergent like a complete fool. But gradually, I started to notice things. Patrick started calling more, not just to check in, but to ask questions. Had I updated the will since Margaret passed? Had I talked to a financial planner? What were my intentions with the house? He said he was asking because he was worried about me. He said he wanted to make sure I was protected. I believed him. He was my son. Why wouldn't I believe him? Barry, on the other hand, had gone quiet. He'd come for the funeral, stayed 3 days, and then I barely heard from him for weeks. When I called, he answered, but there was something restrained about him, like he was choosing his words carefully. At the time, I thought he was just grieving in his own way. Some people go inward. Barry always did. It wasn't until much later that I understood what that carefulness actually meant. I called Patrick first. He answered on the first ring, which surprised me. Patrick is usually in meetings. I told him what Chester had said, that he needed us to come to the property together, that he'd found something in the workshop. Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did he find?" I told him I didn't know. He said, "Did you ask him?" I said he'd told me to come see it in person. Another pause. Then Patrick said, "Okay, I can drive up this afternoon. I'll be there by 2. His voice was steady. Too steady, maybe, but I didn't think about that at the time. Then I called Barry. Barry picked up on the 4th ring, and I could hear road noise, like he was driving somewhere. I told him the same thing. Chester had found something in the workshop. We needed to come together, both of us. Barry said, "Dad, what kind of something?" I said I didn't know. He said, "Is everything okay? Are you okay?" That right there. That's the difference between my 2 sons, and I didn't fully understand it until I was standing in that workshop later that afternoon. Patrick asked what was found. Barry asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. Confused, but fine. Could he come? He said he'd rearrange his afternoon and be there by 2:30. Chester met us outside. He was a big man, Chester, broad-shouldered, mid-50s, the kind of guy who looks like he's been doing physical work his whole life. He had sawdust on his forearms and a look on his face that I didn't quite know how to read. Patrick got there first 5 minutes before me. I saw his BMW in the driveway when I pulled in. He was already standing near the workshop door with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at Chester like he was waiting for a presentation to start. Barry got there 20 minutes late, apologizing, said there'd been an accident on 64 that backed everything up. Chester waited until all 3 of us were standing together. Then he said, "Gentlemen, I want to be straightforward with you. What I found, I almost didn't say anything, but it didn't sit right with me to just keep working and not tell somebody." He pushed open the workshop door. Margaret's shelves were mostly cleared out now, her ceramics boxed up and moved to the garage. The walls were down to studs on one side, where Chester's crew had started the renovation, and in the far corner, behind where a section of drywall had been removed, was a gap in the framing, a space that shouldn't have been there. Inside it was a lockbox, metal, about the size of a shoebox, old but solid. It had a combination dial on the front. Chester said, "We thought it was part of the original construction at first, but look at the framing around it. It was put in after. Someone built a little shelf in there on purpose, then drywalled over it." I stared at that box for a long time. I knew Margaret for 41 years. I knew her handwriting, her laugh, the way she hummed old church songs when she was washing dishes. I knew that she took her coffee with 2 sugars and never forgave the neighbor's dog for digging up her rose beds in 2009. I did not know about the box. Patrick said, "Do you know the combination, Dad?" I said I didn't even know the box existed. I watched his expression when I said that. Just for a second, something crossed his face. I couldn't name it then. I filed it away. It took a locksmith 2 hours to get it open. Inside was a large envelope, sealed, with my name written on it in Margaret's handwriting. Beneath the envelope were 4 smaller ones, each labeled separately. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in an old cloth, was a set of papers held together with a binder clip. Chester and his guys stepped outside to give us privacy. I sat down in the one folding chair I kept in the workshop and opened the envelope with my name on it. It took me a while to get through it. Margaret's handwriting was neat, but my eyes aren't what they were, and after the first paragraph I had to stop and take a breath. She had written it 14 months before she died. She knew, even then, that the diagnosis was serious. She hadn't told me the full extent of it until much later, but she'd had time alone with the information, and she had used that time to do something careful and deliberate and entirely like her. She wrote, "I know you'll be angry that I didn't tell you sooner. I know you'll say we should have faced it together. You're right, but I needed some time to think clearly before I talked to you, and this is what I thought through." She had discovered something about Patrick, not all at once. It had come to her in pieces over about 18 months. She described it carefully, the way she always did everything, methodically, without embellishment. A discrepancy she noticed in our joint account statements, money moving in small amounts to an account she didn't recognize. When she investigated, and Margaret, who had kept every financial record we ever had in organized folders going back to 1987, was very good at investigating, she found that Patrick had set up a power of attorney document using an old form I'd signed years ago for a different purpose. He'd had it modified, she believed, by someone he knew. It gave him limited access to certain financial accounts. He had been moving money out for 2 years. Not huge sums at any one time. A few hundred here, 1,000 there, careful, patient. The way Patrick did everything. The total, as best as she could calculate, was just over $63,000. She had not confronted him. She wrote that she was afraid of what that confrontation would do to our family, to me specifically. She knew how much I loved my sons. She knew what it would cost me. So instead, she had quietly, over the months that followed, taken steps to protect what was left. She had met with our attorney, a woman named Sandra Holt, who had handled our estate planning for years, and she had revised our wills and trusts in ways that required specific conditions to be met before any assets transferred. She had moved certain accounts, she had documented everything, and she had hidden the documentation in the workshop, behind a wall she knew no one would open until she was gone, and I finally did something about that studio. She ended the letter. I couldn't fix this for you. I'm sorry. I could only try to slow it down and leave you the tools to handle it yourself. You were always stronger than you thought you were, Theodore. Don't let grief make you forget that. Theodore. She was the only one who called me that. Everyone else calls me Ted. I sat in that folding chair for a long time. When I came out, Patrick was leaning against his car on his phone. Barry was sitting on the back step of the workshop, elbows on his knees, waiting. I told Barry to go for a drive, come back in an hour. I needed to talk to Patrick alone. Barry looked at me for a moment, then nodded and got in his truck without asking questions. Patrick straightened up when he saw my face. He put his phone in his pocket. I didn't shout. I want to be clear about that. I am 68 years old, and I have never been a man who shouts, and I didn't become one that afternoon. I kept my voice level. I told him what I'd read. I told him what his mother had found, and what she had done, and what she had done, and what she had chosen not to say to him before she died. He was quiet while I talked. When I finished, he said, "Dad, there's context you don't have." I said, "Then give it to me." He said he'd had some financial difficulties a few years back, an investment that went wrong. He'd intended to pay it back. I said, "You used a document I signed for a completely different purpose. You had it altered." He said, "I was going to fix it." I said, "Your mother died knowing what you'd done. She spent the last year of her life protecting me from finding out because she didn't want to put me through it. And you let her." That one landed. I could see it on his face. He started to say something about lawyers, about things being complicated, about how he talked to Sandra Holt himself and straighten everything out. I told him to stop talking and listen. I told him that Sandra Holt had already been contacted, that she had a full copy of everything Margaret had left in that box, that the accounts Patrick had accessed had been restructured in ways that were going to be very difficult for him to untangle, and that if he attempted to untangle them, certain information would go to people it had not yet reached. I told him to go home. He said, "Dad." I said, "Go home, Patrick." He went. Barry came back an hour later. He found me still outside, sitting on the tailgate of my old truck, looking at nothing in particular. He sat next to me and didn't say anything for a while. That's always been Barry's way. He doesn't fill silence just to fill it. Finally, he said, "Was it bad?" I said it was. He said, "Is it something I should know about?" I thought about that. I thought about Margaret's letter and what she'd said about protecting me from the cost of knowing. I thought about whether I owed Barry the same protection or whether protecting people from hard truths was the thing that had let everything get as bad as it did. I said, "Yeah, you should know." I told him everything. It took a while. When I finished, Barry sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "How long did Mom know?" I said, "About a year and a half, from what I could tell." He said, "She carried that alone." I said she did. He put his hand on my shoulder and we sat there until the sun got low and the temperature dropped, and I finally said we should go inside. The weeks that followed were not simple. Sandra Holt walked me through everything Margaret had set up with the patience of a person who has guided a lot of grieving people through complicated paperwork. The trust structures Margaret had put in place were solid. Sandra had helped build them. They required probate to proceed normally, and the modifications Patrick had made to his power of attorney were outside the scope of what the original document had ever authorized. She had a colleague, a man named Roger Ames, who specialized in financial elder law, review the whole file. Roger was direct. He said what Patrick had done had a name, and that name was not a small thing. He laid out my options carefully: prosecution, civil recovery, or a structured agreement in which Patrick repaid the full amount with interest over a fixed period, signed away any claims against the estate, and agreed to no further legal action on my end. I chose the third option, not because I forgave him. I want to be honest about that. I am not there yet, and I may not get there. But I am 68 years old, and I have limited energy, and I did not want to spend what years I have left sitting in courtrooms and giving depositions. I wanted my money back, and I wanted him out of my financial life. Patrick signed the agreement 3 weeks later in Sandra's office. He didn't look at me when he signed it. I looked at him. I looked at him the whole time because I wanted to remember exactly what his face looked like, and because I thought about Margaret sitting across from Sandra in that same office, going through the same papers, alone, knowing what she knew, and I thought the least I could do was bear witness. There's one more thing, and it's the part of this story I think about most. About 2 months after all of that was settled, Barry called me on a Sunday morning. He said he had something he wanted to tell me, and he was nervous about it, and would I be upset if he came over? I said, of course not, come over. He got there around noon. He sat down at the kitchen table and he said, "Dad, I've been talking to someone, a woman. Her name is Carolyn. She's a teacher. She has 2 kids from a previous marriage, and I think she's pretty great." I looked at my son sitting at the kitchen table where he'd eaten cereal as a little boy, and I said, "Tell me about her." He talked for 45 minutes about how they'd met at a fundraiser for the school library, about how she'd made him laugh the first night in a way he hadn't laughed in a long time, about her kids, a boy, 11, and a girl, 8, and how he wasn't sure yet what that meant for things, but that he didn't want to ignore it out of fear. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Your mother would have liked her." Barry looked at me for a second, and I could see him work to keep his face steady. He said, "Yeah?" I said, "Anyone who can make you talk for 45 minutes straight without stopping for air, your mother would have loved her." He laughed, a real laugh. And for a minute, sitting at that kitchen table, I felt something I hadn't felt since March. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the shape of it, the outline of a life that was still worth living. Margaret left a note for Barry, too, in one of those smaller sealed envelopes at the bottom of the lockbox. I gave it to him that Sunday before he left. He read it in his truck in the driveway. I watched from the kitchen window, not to spy on him just because I couldn't help it. It took him a few minutes. When he was done, he sat there for a long moment. Then he got out, came back to the door, and knocked. I opened it. He said, "She told me to take care of you." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm going to." I believed him. The workshop is finished now. Chester and his crew did good work. Proper insulation, new flooring, clean walls. It's a storage space like I planned. Margaret's remaining ceramics are boxed up neatly along one wall, things I can't bring myself to sell, things I keep meaning to look through properly when I'm ready. On the shelf above them, I put the lockbox. I don't know exactly why. It's not decorative. It's not sentimental in any pleasant way. But it belonged to Margaret, and she chose it, and she trusted it to hold the things that needed holding. And I think that means something. I'm 68 years old. I have learned in this last year that people you love are capable of things you never saw coming, in both directions. That grief can make you blind, or it can make you slow down and look more carefully than you ever have before. That the people who ask, "Are you okay?" are worth more than the ones who ask, "What was found?" And I have learned that a woman who loved me enough to spend the last year of her life quietly building walls to protect me, instead of asking me to carry what she was carrying, that kind of love doesn't go anywhere just because the person is gone. It stays in the walls. It stays in the box on the shelf. It stays in the way my younger son knocked on the door that Sunday and said simply, "I'm going to. I would do better. I would see more clearly. I would not let grief hollow me out until I was just a shape of a man going through motions." I owed her that much. I think I always will. I've had a lot of time to think about how all this unfolded. Not in a bitter way, not anymore, just honestly. The way you do when something is finally over and you can look at the whole shape of it without flinching. What I keep coming back to is this: the choices people make don't disappear. They accumulate. Patrick didn't become who he became overnight. It was a slow drift, a small justification here, a quiet rationalization there, until he was standing in my driveway telling me there was context I didn't have, as if $63,000 was a misunderstanding. That's what I mean when I say consequences are patient. They don't announce themselves, they just wait. Margaret understood that. She was the sharpest person I ever knew, and not because she was educated, though she was, because she paid attention. She noticed the discrepancy in the accounts. She sat with what she found and thought it through instead of reacting. She made decisions under the worst circumstances a person can face, quietly without anyone to lean on, and every one of those decisions held up. That's not luck. That's a lifetime of choosing to think before acting, even when acting feels better. I didn't have her clarity when she was gone. Grief does something to you. It narrows your vision down to the next hour, the next task. I wasn't seeing what was happening around me because I was just trying to survive the days. That's understandable, but it's also how people take advantage of you, not always dramatically. Sometimes just through patience and proximity and the assumption that you're too tired to look closely. Barry never tried to take advantage of anything. He just showed up and sat next to me and waited. He asked if I was okay before he asked anything else. I think about that a lot, how one question can tell you everything about a person's character. Not what they want from a situation, but what they actually care about. There's something I want to say about intelligence because people confuse it with cleverness. Patrick was clever. He knew how to structure things, how to move quietly, how to stay one step ahead. But real intelligence, the kind that actually matters in a life, is knowing the difference between what you can get away with and what you can live with. Patrick failed that test, and the painful truth is that cleverness without integrity doesn't build anything. It just hollows things out. What saved me wasn't anger. It wasn't even the documentation Margaret left behind, as important as that was. What saved me was deciding to look clearly at what was in front of me, even when it hurt. To stop protecting myself from the truth and start letting the truth protect me. I'm 68. I don't have unlimited time to spend on regret or bitterness. What I do have is a son who knocked on my door on a Sunday and said he was going to take care of me. A workshop that's clean and quiet. A lockbox on a shelf that reminds me every time I see it that the person who loved me most spent her last year making sure I'd be okay without her. That's what I want to carry forward. Not what was taken, what was left.